I've been painting with watercolor pencils for about 2 years now, and I thought that it'd be fun to share with you in this video what my favorite supplies are, because they are the ones that help me up my game very quickly. Hi, I'm Françoise. Welcome back to my channel. Maybe you're new here and you haven't watched any of my watercolor pencils videos, and I know there's not a lot of information about them online. So a lot of people see them as a sketching tool or just a tool to add a few touch-ups to a watercolor painting, but you can actually do a lot more. You can paint anything you like as long as you know how to use them and what to use them with. Compared to watercolors, the true strength of watercolor pencils is that they might feel more approachable to those who are used to pencils and aren't as familiar with painting with a lot of water. They also come with their own unique capabilities, and we'll go over that in more depth while I paint this beautiful sunrise on the beach landscape and show you my favorite supplies. I know this one is obvious because yes, to paint with watercolor pencils, you need watercolor pencils, but hear me out. Because the thing is that a lot of beginners don't always realize that not all watercolor pencils are made equal, and that will greatly affect your results. And that's exactly why you'll always see me use the same brands in all the videos I've made about the medium, except when I want to try a new brand and review it. My favorite watercolor pencils are the Faber-Castell Auberge d'Or and the Caran d'Ache Museum Aquarelle watercolor pencils, and by far. I've tried a few other kinds, and like everything, I've noticed that some perform really badly, others are okay or even pretty good, but the two I just mentioned are excellent. Reasons why they are so good is because they're creamy when others are dry, and that makes it easy to use them. They're also sturdy when others break easily, and that just makes one's lives better, as you can imagine. They also last longer because of it. And they're also vibrant when others seem so bland, and that of course helps paint more beautiful artworks. And besides the results, they just feel better, and they give me an agreeable painting experience. And if you're used to drawing or painting, I know that you know how important it is for a long-term practice to actually take place. And I found that the prices do reflect the quality. So I'd recommend to avoid very cheap brands. And if the two types that I use seem too expensive right now, you can easily make do with a basic 12 pencil set, or also get them in open stock and build your collection little by little. For me, small sets are not a problem because I rarely use a bunch of colors in my paintings. I find that the primaries are more than enough. And when you keep watching, I'll introduce a few tools that I love to use to add deep shadows and great highlights. Another obvious supply, but worth talking about because not all papers will give you the same results, and I'm going to share which ones work the best for me. But in general, it's fine to use drawing paper or even cheap watercolor papers, when for watercolors, I'd tell you to stick to the best 100% cotton watercolor papers. I've tried watercolor pencils on all kinds of papers before, and two things matter most. I think the thickness, the weight of the paper is important, and I recommend 270 to 300 grams per square meter papers, just so the water can get through or make it buckle too easy. Then I've found that a smooth texture is better as long as it is not silky smooth and has a little bit of tooth to it. That's why I'll go with cold press watercolor papers most times, and especially today because as you can see, I'm using water to paint a background. When I don't use as much water, a hot press watercolor paper will do, and prices don't seem to affect the outcome as much as they do with watercolor pencils. My favorite papers are Arches and Saunders Waterford 100% cotton watercolor papers, cold press. And I also like the Stillman & Birn Beta and Delta sketchbooks, cold press, and fit for wet and dry media, which means you can paint or draw with a bunch of different tools in these sketchbooks. This is where it gets interesting with watercolor pencils and why I love them so much, because I love to try a bunch of creative techniques with them. And a first favorite of mine is a palette or something similar with a rough texture, or the affordable alternative, a scrap piece of your least favorite watercolor paper. The goal here is to create swatches of paint by just scribbling on whatever option you choose, and then activate the pigment with a wet brush. I love this technique because it gets rid of two big drawbacks of watercolor pencils. The first one is that coloring takes forever on large areas. And with this technique, the cool thing is you get to work with a paintbrush like watercolors and it's much faster. The other drawback is that watercolor pencils tend to leave streaks beneath a blended area. But with the swatch technique, it doesn't happen and the paint looks smooth and even. That's why for skies or any landscape painting with a background, I'll use that technique first. I find that I'm able to get the best of both worlds between watercolor and pencils because here, as you can see, the paint blends well, the background is fast to paint, and colors melt into one another nicely and smoothly. And you'll see how I also use the pencils directly later in this painting. If you're a beginner, however, I'd recommend to go for a shape like this one, or even that one, and skip backgrounds at first. These are my Skillshare classes. I also offer a whole bunch of watercolor pencil tutorials on Patreon in real time for a small monthly fee, including the landscape I'm painting today. And I'll link all of that in the description of the video if you need my help. Before we move on to another favorite supply, notice that it's easy to layer a second time with watercolor pencils, even a third and a fourth time if I chose to. And that's because I'm using top quality pencils and paper, my Faber-Castell Arbor Stir pencils, and the Saunders Waterford 100% cotton cold pressed watercolor paper. And that's why I had to mention those supplies first because they change everything. Now, pencil sharpeners. So a pencil sharpener might seem super obvious when you use any kind of pencil, except that for watercolor pencils, sometimes you don't need it and sometimes you do. And that's because the pigment from a pencil can be activated with water. So sometimes there's no need to color like you might with a colored pencil to be as careful because all the nooks and crannies in the paper will fill up thanks to the added water later. It's still a good idea to be careful enough and not press really hard so you don't indent the paper and create streaks. Here I'm applying pigment lightly by holding the pencil so it's almost parallel with the sheet. When I want more detail, more color, I can use the tip and press slightly harder. So you see how the way that you hold the pencil also gets you different results here. So I just said that most times you don't need to sharpen your pencils that much, but in the case of this specific painting here, if you look at those tiny birds and those very tiny lines for the waves, I think it's going to be interesting to work with a sharp lead, and that's when I would pick up my pencil sharpener and actually use it. And I've found that a simple sharpener like this one works best with my watercolor pencils. That's just personal preference because I have a lot of fancy ones and I find that they don't work as well with every type of pencil, especially those with a softer lead. So in general, look for signs as the lead not breaking and the lead coming to a sharp point, and if that happens, then you know you're good with that sharpener you're using. I've added color here to place more detail in my painting, and you'll see later that I'm not done yet because this is my first detailed layer and I want to activate it before adding more definition and build a better contrast between all the colors. And my go-to supply to activate watercolor pencils the easy way is to use a rag or a paper towel. And if you watercolor, you might find it utterly normal to have one around since we're using water. But here with watercolor pencils, this basic kitchen tool plays a much bigger role than it does with watercolors. And why I love this simple supply so much is because when I started watercolor pencils, I would struggle when it came to activating the pencils because all the colors would mix into each other and it would turn into a muddy mess and I just couldn't figure it out. So I just set them aside for like 2 years. And then finally I decided to teach myself because I couldn't find anything online. And that's when I discovered the secret. I found that the best way to activate watercolor pencils is done with a rag or a paper towel in hand at all times. And it is when I understood I needed to soak up excess water from a wet paintbrush first, then blend one section of my drawing, Then literally rinse and repeat that I started to enjoy working with watercolor pencils. If you add too much water to any watercolor pencil coloring, which would be the normal thing that any beginner would do at first, colors are more likely to mix with each other and make a big muddy mess. It will be messy and harder to preserve the coloring. And if you soak up the excess, but you forget to rinse the brush often, or you try and activate an entire area of the drawing in one go, you'll just keep transferring the color that you just activated onto new areas. And as you guessed, in a few seconds, everything will get dirty and muddy. And this is probably why it's the most important watercolor pencil technique of all that a single paper towel or rag can help you achieve easily. If you use great pencils and paper and you practice this, I'm pretty sure it will change your experience right away. Water-soluble graphite. I love this tool, and if you watch my videos, you probably came across a few of them where I use it. And it works just like any other watercolor pencils, the only difference is that it's graphite. I sharpened this 4B water-soluble graphite pencil as well because I wanted to use it to enhance the shadows in my painting. And it's really fantastic to serve that purpose and also add a vintage look to a drawing if you like it. Because I tried black instead before, or even a brown watercolor pencil, and it's a different flavor. It makes the painting a little bit heavier, I find. I also find that my Faber-Castell water-soluble graphite pencils are really easy to apply. I can also easily get them to look very opaque by adding more pressure and more pigment to a given area. So for shadows and great depth, they're nice. And you can see now how much more defined the painting is looking, how much better the birds show, and how easily I can shape the waves. Another fantastic tool that I'm pretty sure comes with all the 24 watercolor pencil sets is a white pencil. I've enjoyed using it since I started studying watercolor pencils, and my favorite way to do it is to wet the lead to soften it, and then add these crisp bits of pigment wherever I need a highlight. So I've had some comments here and there that you shouldn't wet a pencil in water like this. But if you just wet the lead and the wood doesn't touch the water, then I think it's fine. Here it's really cool to create foam that looks like foam and that also stands out, but not too much. It still looks natural enough. And it's also possible to use the pencil dry for discrete highlights. If you don't have a white watercolor pencil, you won't be able to use that technique if the tool that you're using is not water soluble, but you can use a regular colored pencil or a white gel pen. You could use also white gouache or white watercolor with slightly different but still similar results. So you can see that it is not a must when you only want to buy a 12 pencil box set, but it will be handy for crisp highlights using the wet lead technique. With the water-soluble graphite pencil, I add a bit more definition for a better 3D effect. Now I have the highlights. And as you can see, we don't always need to activate the pigment. We can just leave it as it is. I've enjoyed painting this calm landscape very much, and you can bet these supplies are a huge part of that. Even if, as usual, practice, of course, is key, but so are the tools that you use. To learn how to use watercolor pencils, the actual techniques, I suggest you watch this video next. Otherwise, check out the complete playlist in the video description. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.